Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the Russian economy and specifically about the continued seizure of more assets that have been developed and paid for by countries from outside of Russia. And the latest asset that has now been seized by the state is an airport located in St Petersburg, which interestingly is President Putin's hometown. And this airport, Pulkovo, you may not have heard of it, is actually the second largest in Russia in terms of number of people using it. Around 17.5 million people used it in the 12 months up to October 2023. And the reason that this airport has grown so significantly is that back in 2010, Russia announced that it wanted to expand the airport, and it invited in companies from overseas to invest in what's known as a PPP project, a public-private initiative. So this was Russia moving into the modern world, doing the sort of thing that's done in lots of countries all around the world, where you have assets that were previously owned by the state, but you invite in private companies to make investment. They pay for all of the development, and then they share in the future profits of those assets. Now, when we're talking about making investments into things like airports, they tend to have a long payback period. You have to wait maybe 10, 15, 20, 30, or even 50 years before you start moving into profit. But the good thing about infrastructure is that it will always be needed. It doesn't go out of fashion. So you can be comfortable that when you're putting something like $1.3 billion, which was the amount that was needed to develop Pulkovo Airport, you're going to see a very healthy return on that. But obviously, if you lose your investment, if you have to write it off, if somebody seizes that asset from you, then you're never going to recover that value. And that's essentially what's happened with this airport. And of course, this isn't the first time that Russia have done this. This airport is basically the latest in a long line of assets that have been seized in this way. But I think what's interesting about Pulkovo Airport is that some of the investors are actually from the Middle East, from countries that haven't imposed sanctions against Russia. Up until now, President Putin has taken a hard line against what he calls unfriendly countries, so basically anybody that's applying sanctions against Russia. But this is the first time that we've really seen a seizure of assets involving countries that are not actually imposing any sanctions against him. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of Pulkovo Airport, how it was developed and what companies are involved, what countries they're from. We'll then look at the latest announcement, the current decree that's been issued to take over control of this airport. We'll take a look at which other companies have either had their assets seized by Russia or had to walk away from their investments. And we'll talk about how much some of those companies have lost. And we are talking billions of dollars here. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the implications of this latest seizure are from Russia's point of view and what the potential impact will be on the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that supported the channel. It really means a lot to me. So if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you. And if you've actually signed up to support the channel on a regular basis by becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member, thank you so much. And if you're interested in winning this little red dog, then please watch the video at the end of today's video. In 2010, Pulkovo Airport in Russia became the first to be developed on the basis of a public-private partnership, referred to as PPP. The PPP agreement came into effect with three parties: the St Petersburg city government, where the airport is located, Pulkovo Airport Company, and the Northern Capital Gateway Consortium. This consortium consisted of Fraport, the German business which operates Frankfurt Airport in Germany, as well as a variety of international airports in countries such as India, China, Turkey, Brazil and Peru, the Russian bank VTB, and a Cypriot investor. Initially, Fraport had a 35.5% ownership of Pulkovo Airport. VTB, the Russian bank, was providing debt finance and had a 50% stake in the airport, alongside a Cypriot investor that had a 7.5% stake and a Greek investor with a 7% stake. The consortium acquired the airport with the rights to operate, develop and modernise it, and a concession was granted for 30 years. The plans put together by the consortium required investment of over $1.3 billion. Between 2009, which was the year before the concession was awarded to Northern Capital Gateway, and 2019, which was prior to the COVID pandemic, traffic at Pulkovo Airport increased from 6.7 million passengers per year to 19.6 million. And this meant that Pulkovo became the fourth busiest airport in Russia after the three main airports in Moscow. Passenger numbers at the airport fell by 44% in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic, but recovered by 66% in 2021 to 18 million, led by strong domestic demand. However, growth in 2022 was just 0.6%, which was a minuscule increase compared to those recorded at Fraport's other foreign airports, due primarily to the economic and operational sanctions imposed against Russia as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. In October 2016, the consortium sold a 24.99% stake in the airport, including 10.5% of Fraport's holding, to Qatar Investment Authority, and in 2017, VTB sold a further 25% stake in the airport to Mubadala Development Company, which is the investment arm of the Abu Dhabi Wealth Fund, as well as other leading Middle Eastern and Asian co-investors. As a result of this sale, VTB ended up with ownership of 25.01% of the airport. The German company Fraport and the Qatar Investment Company each had a 25% stake, and the remaining investors had a combined stake of 24.99%. Now, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which commenced in February 2022, Fraport, the German business, announced that it was walking away from its operational management role of the airport, but retained its stake in the business. President Putin has ordered the transfer of all of the rights to managing St Petersburg's Pullkovo airport from foreign shareholders, including Germany's Fraport AG and the Qatari Wealth Fund, by shifting their stakes into a new Russian entity. Under a decree published late on Thursday the 30th of November, shareholdings in the Cyprus-registered concession that runs the airport of Russia's second largest city will be consolidated in a new domestic company. Existing investors, which also include a consortium with Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, Mubadala Investment Co., will retain their stakes but won't be able to vote because those rights will only be held by Russian shareholders in the new company. German airport operator Fraport, the Qatari Investment Authority, and Russia's VTB Bank each hold around 25% of the concession. The remainder is controlled by a consortium of investors, including Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Russian investment vehicle RDIF, Mubadala and Bering Vostok. The decision on Pulkovo relied on laws signed long before the invasion of Ukraine and was based on a threat to the national interest and economic security of the Russian Federation resulting from the violation of obligations by certain foreign legal entities. President Putin also told the government to create a new management body for the operator of Pulkovo. The airport in his home city is now the second busiest in Russia by passenger turnover, serving 17.5 million passengers in the 12 months ending October 2023. Fraport is currently evaluating the consequences of the Kremlin's decision, and the company has already written down the value of its holding to zero following the attack on Ukraine. There has been no comment so far from the Qatari Investment Association and Mubadala. BP is the company that has incurred the single biggest loss as part of their full exit out of Russia and declared a write-down of $24 billion relating to its stakes in Rosneft and two other joint ventures in Russia. The company that's incurred the second biggest loss in the world is the French business Total Energies and has recorded impairment costs of $10.7 billion. Shell, which is the world's largest trader of liquefied natural gas, and had been involved in a joint venture facility on the island of Sakhalin with Russia, have written off $5 billion of investment as a result of their decision to fully exit from Russia. ExxonMobil, the giant US oil business, was one of the first to develop a joint venture in Russia and has disclosed a $3.4 billion write-down relating to its full exit from the country. German energy business Uniper owned and operated 5 power plants in Russia, and despite the fact that Germany is at the forefront of the sanctions against Russia, the company continued to operate these plants until President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets for the Russian state, and as a result of this, Uniper incurred a write-off of $5 billion. Finnish energy business Fortum owned and operated 7 thermal power plants in Russia, as well as a variety of wind and solar plants. The company was in the process of organising a controlled exit by selling these operations to a Russian business. However, this sale process was upended when President Putin issued a decree seizing control of all of the assets, and as a result of this, Fortum incurred a write-off of $2 billion. OMV, the Austrian energy business, has taken a €2 billion hit on its decision to exit. The Norwegian business Equinor has shut all its facilities, incurring a loss of $1.1 billion, and Enel, the Italian utility business, sold its 56% stake in Enel Russia for around 137 million euros, incurring a loss of 1.3 billion euros. The French bank Société Générale had the largest exposure as a result of its ownership of Russian bank Rosbank. Directly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, SocGen started the process of selling this stake, and it was sold to a Russian oligarch, and SocGen incurred a loss of 3.2 billion euros on the deal. Italian bank UniCredit had the second largest exposure to the Russian market, and so far has booked a 1.3 billion euro loss relating to all of the loans that it currently has out to Russian companies and individuals. French bank Crédit Agricole had the third largest exposure and has taken a hit of 500 million euros. Austrian bank RECESSION International had a variety of branches and so far has taken a hit of 301 million euros. Italian insurer Generali also had large exposure and so far has taken a hit of 138 million euros. American bank Citigroup had developed a commercial and consumer banking business in Russia over the course of the last 20 years and so far has incurred charges of $170 million relating to that exposure. And Swiss banking giant UBS has so far written off $100 million and so far has reduced its loan exposure from $600 million to $400 million. Over the last 20 years or so, McDonald's had built an extensive network of stores in Russia. However, McDonald's has taken the decision to exit entirely from Russia and has sold all of its stores to a Russian business who's had to rebrand it and is not allowed to use the McDonald's name. And as part of that deal, McDonald's have incurred a loss of $1.4 billion. AB InBev, the large Belgian brewer, had a non-controlling stake in a Russian joint venture and has written off $1.1 billion as part of its exit. Carlsberg, the Danish brewer, had 8 breweries and 8,400 employees in Russia and was in the process of selling this to a Russian business when President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets from the company for no value. And as a result of this action, Carlsberg incurred a write-off of $1.4 billion. Danone, the French food manufacturer, which had an extensive dairy products business and also an infant milk business in Russia, was in the process of selling this to a Russian buyer when President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets for Russian ownership, and as a result of this, Danone incurred a write-off of $1 billion. Heineken, the world's second largest brewer, had 7 breweries and 1,800 employees in Russia, but sold these operations to a Russian business for a token value of €1, incurring a loss of $325 million. US tobacco giant Philip Morris has discontinued sales of a number of Marlboro and Parliament cigarette products in Russia and has taken a hit of over $1 billion. Henkel, the makers of a number of consumer products, including Persil washing detergent and Pritt glue, has also incurred a write-off of €1 billion as part of its exit from the country. French car maker Renault had set up its own facilities in Russia and also had a majority stake in Russia's biggest car maker, AutoVAZ. As a result of the invasion of Ukraine, Renault has now exited from the country and sold its stake in AutoVAZ for €1 ruble, incurring a loss of €867 million in the year. Nissan, the Japanese car company, had also set up facilities in Russia. However, they have now sold this for €1 to a Russian state-owned entity, incurring a loss of $687 million. Volkswagen, the German car business, had set up a truck division under its Traton brand and have now disposed of this, incurring a loss of €550 million. Volvo, the Swedish car manufacturer, had a factory in the southeast of Moscow that produced around 3,000 vehicles annually. And when this was sold to a Russian business, the company wrote down the full amount of its investment of around $860 million. Ford had a 49% stake in the Russian-based Solarz Ford joint venture, which in 2021 sold around 20,000 vehicles in Russia. However, the stake has now been sold in Russia and Ford have fully exited the market, taking a $122 million write-down. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because Russia has seized yet another major asset that's basically been built and paid for by overseas companies. And I think what's really interesting about this particular seizure is that it relates to a PPP development. Now, this is a concept where public assets are developed using private money. So you go to private companies and allow them to take some percentage ownership of your public assets. But rather than offering this opportunity just to Russian companies, Russia decided to cast the net worldwide. And Fraport, the German company that operates the airport in Frankfurt, as well as many other airports around the world, won the tender and invested a huge amount of money to get a 25% stake. And alongside Fraport, the Qatar Wealth Fund decided to also take a 25% stake. And we are talking about a project that was costing $1.4 billion. So a 25% stake would equate to more than $300 billion. So this is a serious chunk of change that these guys were signing up to. And the reason that they did that is because they know that airports have long-term value. In 50 or 100 years, it's likely that those airports will still be operating. And so you can sit back and watch the money roll in after you've made your initial investment, or at least that was the theory. And as we saw from the data earlier, once the development was actually completed, the German bank VTB decided to actually sell down some of its investment to some more investors. So we saw the Abu Dhabi Wealth Fund come in and take a stake alongside a number of other Middle Eastern operators. And this was a really interesting thing for the Russian bank VTB to do, because it was giving up the future rights to all of that income in exchange for a lump sum up front. Now, obviously what's happened since has worked out very nicely for VTB, because all of the overseas investors have lost all of their investment. It's been a complete write-off, because President Putin has now stepped in, issued yet another decree and taken over control of this airport. So if we take a step back and have a look at what's happened over the last 15 years, Russia has said to the rest of the world, please come and help us. We need some capital. We need some expertise. We would like you to come in and improve all of our infrastructure. That's happened in St Petersburg, where President Putin is from. He's now got the second biggest airport in the whole of Russia in his hometown. But for the overseas investors, it's been a complete disaster. They've gone in, they've done all the hard yards, they put in lots of capital, they've got that airport operating to its maximum capacity, and the ultimate outcome is that they now have nothing to show for it. They've lost all of their investment, written off everything. So clearly there is going to be very little appetite for anybody doing this in the future. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, does it really matter, because all the sanctions are now in place against Russia, so nobody actually wants to do any business with them. But Russia still needs investment, and it still needs overseas expertise. And I think what's really interesting about this particular situation is the fact that Russia have decided to burn the Middle East investors. The Qatari Wealth Fund is an absolutely huge investor globally. The Wealth Fund itself currently has $300 billion worth of investments, but there is a pool of capital sitting behind that is almost potentially unlimited. And interestingly, Qatar hasn't applied any sanctions directly against Russia. So it's classified as a friendly nation from President Putin's point of view. So therefore, he could now get more investment from Qatar without incurring any issues. And the same goes for Abu Dhabi. Now, Abu Dhabi is the capital of the United Arab Emirates. Now in today's video, we've seen a succession of companies and countries that have lost huge amounts of money that they'd previously invested into Russia. So it's very unlikely that any of those will want to re-engage with Russia, even if the war in Ukraine does stop. But what I think is really puzzling about the current situation is that Russia isn't looking after its own interests. President Putin should be looking to nurture any relationships that he can where he could get some capital investment into the country to develop things like Russia's liquefied natural gas output and to invest further into its oil and gas businesses. So torching the relationships with Qatar and the United Arab Emirates by seizing this airport doesn't look like a smart move. And in the long term, this could have really negative implications and come back to bite Russia, because the more channels of investment that President Putin cuts off, the more isolated Russia will be. And as we've talked about many times before on the channel, Russia is currently running a huge deficit. It's running down its own wealth fund and reserves. And at some point, if this situation continues, Russia will run out of cash, and therefore it needs to keep as much overseas investment as possible coming into the country to keep things on an even keel. And if this situation continues, Russia could find itself in a world of pain. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Don't forget, if you'd like to win this red dog, then please watch the video at the end of today's video. But in the meantime, let's have a look at something to put a smile on your face. I'm constantly being asked about the statues in the background of my video, and I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give one of these away as a prize. This guy here, who's an electroplated resin statue of a balloon dog. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I once posted a video about a balloon dog called Squeaky. Now this is a really fantastic piece, really reflective, quite heavy, and would make a great addition to any home. And you can win this for just £1, which is the equivalent of around $1.30, so really affordable. So rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle that I've set up to win this? Now, to keep things above board, I've got an independent company to take the cash for me and do the draw. So everything will be entirely independent. I won't be picking the winner. It will be all at random. But I will post this to anybody in the world that wins it. There is a possibility that you might need to pay a little bit of import tax depending on where you live and what the import duties are. But this is your opportunity to win a genuine Joe Bloggs sculpture. So buy yourself a ticket and good luck in the draw.